Howdy everyone, and welcome to the Serial Geek TV YouTube channel. My name is James Eatock, and today we're going to take a look at an animated series based on a character that does whatever a spider can. Not Spider-Man, but Spider-Woman. In the late 70s, Marvel Comics began an effort to create female counterparts to some of their most popular male comic book characters, and one of the most notable was Spider-Woman. Spider-Woman first appeared in print in issue 32 of Marvel's Spotlight in 1977, and, despite her name, had virtually no connection with her more famous male counterpart. Rather than being bitten by a radioactive spider, she was said to have actually been a spider that had been evolved into human form by the High Evolutionary, subsequently becoming an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., known initially as Agent Arachne. Spider-Woman's initial appearance was deemed successful enough that the character was given her own ongoing comic book series, which began in 1978. Whilst her general story as seen in Marvel's Spotlight remained intact, a noticeable retcon was the removal of the idea that Spider-Woman had once in fact been an actual spider. Thank goodness. This change was most likely to make the character more palatable to the readers. The revised comic book origin now stated that Jessica Drew had been accidentally exposed to radiation, not that kind of radiation, with her father, Dr. Jonathan Drew, then using an experimental serum based on irradiated spider's blood to save her life. My friend, whom I've mentioned on this channel numerous times before, Lee Clevenger, you know, that guy in that one single photo with John Irwin, the voice of He-Man, is probably the biggest fan of the Spider-Woman comic book that I personally know. When I mentioned to him that I was working on a Spider-Woman video for the channel, even though he's not really a fan of the cartoon, he made a comment to me, one that he isn't even aware that I'm about to include in this video. Lee stated, "Jessica Drew, as written in the first 20 issues of her 50-issue series, is one of my favourite tragic characters ever, innocent but vicious due to her ignorance of the world and its social norms. Humans are both allured by her and terrified due to her unchecked pheromones, which she is completely unaware of, and her lack of mastery over her venom powers makes her a danger both intentionally and unintentionally." The same year that Spider-Woman's ongoing comic book began, DePatie Frayling Productions produced the new Fantastic Four. The company maintained their relationship with Marvel Productions by producing a Spider-Woman animated series which debuted the following year in 1979. Just as the new Fantastic Four took liberties with the original source material, see Herbie the Robot, so too did DePatie Frayling take liberties with Spider-Woman. However, although the new Fantastic Four still broadly reflected the original comics, DePatie Frayling's Spider-Woman would essentially be an all-new character, only loosely based upon the comics of the same name, perhaps in part due to the character having only recently been introduced into the comics by that point. As the series' opening credits explain, the animated Spider-Woman, while still named Jessica Drew, gained her powers as a result of an accident, having been bitten by a poisonous spider, later revealed in the episode The Spider-Woman and the Fly, to have been a genetically modified cloned spider. Her father, Dr. Alexandra Drew, administered an untested spider serum to successfully save his daughter's life, but with the unintended side effect of her now having spider-like powers. While, like Spider-Man, she was able to spin webs and scale walls, Spider-Woman also possessed further powers such as a virtually clairvoyant spider sense far more potent than Spider-Man's, spider telepathy, enabling her to actually communicate with other spiders, venom blasts, which were bolts of energy fired from her hands, and lastly, the ability to fly. All abilities typically seen with spiders, though maybe not as visually dramatic. While initially appearing to emanate as natural abilities from Spider-Woman herself, dialogue in several episodes implies that Spider-Woman's webbing and venom blasts were artificially generated, but this is never elaborated on, with these instances more often than not coinciding with convenient dramatic points in a given episode. More seldom referred to powers of Spider-Woman in the animated series included her spider hearing, spider shriek, and spider bubble, which enabled her to swim underwater for extended periods of time. Also of note is that Jessica was able to instantly transform into her Spider-Woman guise by simply spinning around, in a visual clearly inspired by the contemporary live-action Wonder Woman series, where Linda Carter's Diana Prince was also able to change between identities in the exact same fashion. Interestingly, the idea of compensating female heroes with additional powers in an animated context was repeated years later with Filmation's She-Ra, who had far more abilities and powers than her twin brother He-Man. Although nominally related to Spider-Man, DePatie Freiling's Spider-Woman seemed to take much more inspiration from the 1950s live-action Adventures of Superman series. Jessica Drew was depicted as the editor of Justice magazine, which enabled her to encounter adventures in pursuit of stories. In common with Clark Kent, Jessica often found the flimsiest of excuses to get out of her companion's sight and turn into Spider-Woman. Also, like the Daily Planet as seen in most of the Adventures of Superman 2 decades earlier, Justice magazine, despite having its own building, was frequently depicted as having only a handful of employees. Assisting Jessica were her photographer Jeff Hunt and her cousin Billy. Jeff also doubled as the pilot for the Justice magazine Jetcopter, which took the three of them across the globe in search of stories, usually at the speed of plot. Again, like the Adventures of Superman, Jeff Hunt and Billy essentially took the roles of Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, invariably getting into trouble only for Spider-Woman to come and rescue them. Indeed, in an interesting reversal compared to the male-starring superhero series, Jeff was for the most part consistently depicted as a male counterpart to the damsels in distress of old, with the character acting very foolish most of the time, ironically leading to there being little concession for the true gender equality between the main characters. A final recurring character was Police Chief Cooper, who, while seemingly set up as a regular character in the first episode, ultimately only appeared in a handful of other stories. With the series being an almost totally original creation compared to the comics, it was allowed free rein to include many different types of stories. The sole writer of the series was Jeffrey Scott, and the episodes he wrote included an assorted variety of plots, dealing with an alien invasion of space mummies, complete with obligatory late 70s reference to pyramid power in Pyramids of Terror, marauding ghostly Vikings in The Ghost Vikings, a lost world in the Bermuda Triangle in The Lost Continent, an invasion of Star Wars inspired aliens in Invasion of the Black Hole, and a plot hatched by Dracula himself to turn everyone in the world into universal monsters in Dracula's Revenge. In fact, most other episodes of the series were seeming direct pastiches on popular culture, including riffs of The Thing, A Deadly Dream, The Fly, The Spider-Woman and the Fly, Planet of the Apes and Star Wars, A Crime in Time, and even James Bond, Shuttle to Disaster. Although Spider-Woman was produced at a time when comic book based animation was seen as a mostly disposable medium not to be taken seriously, the cartoon did feature a larger than usual array of blatantly illogical occurrences. In fact, at times writer Jeffrey Scott seemed to care little for logic. Highlights include Spider-Man's abrupt and unexpected appearance in Egypt at the beginning of Pyramids of Terror, with Jessica, Jeff and Billy hopping into their helicopter and journeying to Egypt, which seems to take them less than a few hours. In reality, by helicopter, that impossible journey would take them days, not to mention the fuel required for such a journey. In a similar vein, Spider-Woman would just happen to be on the lookout for a crime no matter where in the world it was occurring, even Loch Ness in Scotland. Another fine example occurs in the episode Games of Doom. In the episode, the villain Jacques, who bears more than a striking resemblance to Vincent Price, albeit a muscle-bound version, is replacing Olympic athletes with androids in a plot to conquer the world. At the conclusion of the episode, it is revealed that Jacques himself is also an android. No big deal there, right? However, a panel opens up on Jacques' chest and out pops a smaller version of Jacques, a miniature human. And that's it. It's never explained who or what he is, where he came from, or anything, just a tiny version of the antagonist. And Jeffrey Scott also seemed to struggle with Spider-Woman's dual identity, seemingly giving up at one point. In the very first episode, Pyramids of Terror, Jessica is prompted to transform into Spider-Woman. However, at the time, she is in the Justice magazine's helicopter alongside Jeff and Billy. So what does she do? She just jumps out of the helicopter with both Jeff and Billy traumatised, having seen Jessica fall to her death. Jeffrey Scott would repeat the same gimmick in the episode Return of the Spider Queen, with Jessica leaping out of the helicopter once more, seemingly to her death yet again. Even though the show had its own unique identity, a few actual Marvel Comics characters made appearances throughout the series' 16 episodes. The first and most notable of these guest characters was Spider-Man himself, who appeared in the series' first episode, Pyramids of Terror, as well as the Congo Spider. This was actually Spider-Man's first appearance in animation since the character's famous show of the 1960s had ended just under a decade earlier. Visually, this was actually the very first time in animation that Spider-Man was depicted with all of the web patterns on his costume, the older animated series having purposely omitted several webs from his character design in order to make it easier and faster to animate. One oddity, however, was that his costume's eyes were coloured yellow, like Spider-Woman's, rather than white. Aside from this, Spider-Man was depicted much like he had been previously, albeit only ever in full costume with no reference whatsoever to either Peter Parker or his job at the Daily Bugle, more than likely so as to not invite direct comparisons with Jessica Drew and her role at Justice magazine. Other Marvel characters appearing with Spider-Woman included Doctor Strange's adversary, Dormammu, and Spider-Man's crime lord villain, the Kingpin. While Spider-Man himself had been depicted somewhat consistently compared with the comics, Dormammu and Kingpin were subject to a little more modification in the Spider-Woman series. Dormammu was still involved in spiritual affairs, in this case attempting to take over the world during a total solar eclipse, but he looked little like his flaming-headed comic book self, actually bearing more of a resemblance to the Green Goblin. On the other hand, Kingpin, while looking much like his comic book counterpart, was depicted quite differently compared to his appearance in print, with his large girth implied to simply be a result of his incessant love of food, rather than layer upon layer of pure muscle. Thankfully, when the Kingpin appeared in the 1981 Spider-Man cartoon, it was stated by the character himself that his girth was all muscle. Also, the series pays homage, or is it thievery, quite blatantly to Star Wars, which had only been released 2 years earlier with this Darth Vader ripoff, complete with lightsaber, and this collection of Wookiees. I mean, the latter isn't even subtle. Actually, now that I think about it, there's another Darth Vader ripoff. This time a female version named Nimara with long flowing locks. Ooh. On the production side of the series, DePatie Frayling's The New Fantastic Four had suffered from a noticeably low standard of animation for an action-adventure series. And so for Spider-Woman, the studio revamped the animation style, which enabled the series to have a much more impressive look and smoother animation than the New Fantastic Four. This paved the way for Marvel Productions' 2 Spider-Man series, for the most part animated in South Korea. There were also some visual cues in this series that seemed to take inspiration from the Filmation's stock library of animation, with numerous speaking sequences being reused when the characters were conversing with one another. The music for Spider-Woman was composed and conducted by Eric Rogers, a British musician whose other notable work had included the Carry On series of British comedy films, with some of those same musical cues actually reused with little alteration in Spider-Woman, and later on in the solo Spider-Man series and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, although Rogers was not actually credited on those shows. Spider-Woman was the second and final Marvel Comics-based series produced by DePatie Frayling Productions, but the show played a key role in Marvel's induction into Hollywood, as the legendary animator Fritz Freleng retired and the company's assets were subsequently incorporated into Marvel Productions. Spider-Woman's comic book adventures ended a few years later in 1983, after 50 issues of her own title. I remember watching Spider-Woman on Children's ITV back in the early 80s. It actually aired in the coveted 4:20 slot, the same time slot that The Incredible Hulk and He-Man and She-Ra would fill when they would air. However, as I have mentioned before on this channel, I was a huge comic book fan as a kid and would purchase both US Marvel Comics and UK Marvel Comics such as Transformers and Secret Wars. So, for those that don't know Secret Wars, Spider-Woman shows up in that highly memorable series. Well, a version of her does anyway. Julia Carpenter was the second Spider-Woman, and visually her costume predates Spider-Man's then new black costume that debuted in the same Secret Wars series, a fact that many people seem to forget. Of course, Spidey's black costume plans were already in place by those working on the series, and this Spider-Woman's costume was designed as a way to explain why Spidey's magical costume looked the way it did, with Spidey surmising that he had subconsciously redesigned his costume to look more like Spider-Woman's. As the Spider-Woman cartoon vanished from UK TV screens and my love of comic books continued, I kind of forgot all about Jessica Drew's Spider-Woman, with Carpenter's Spider-Woman being the one in the forefront of my mind, and this was partly due to Marvel Comics themselves having briefly relegated Jessica Drew to history. It was to be 15 years before the character was formally reintroduced to the comics, where her adventures have continued ever since. In her return appearance, which is sadly now considered non-canon, Spider-Woman scribe and comic book legend Mark Gruenwald had Jessica Drew actually meet Julia Carpenter, where the two had this rather amusing exchange. Thanks to the release of the series on DVD well over a decade ago, I rediscovered the character, and I jumped for joy watching WWE many moons ago and seeing the supremely talented Melina Perez turn up in the ring dressed up as Spider-Woman. Up until recently, Spider-Woman was the only female Marvel superhero to have starred in her own television series, and it's possible that her brief time in the television spotlight played a small part in maintaining a fan base while she was in the comic book wilderness. Thankfully, even in these days of multiple Spider-Men and Spider-Women, Jessica Drew is very much celebrated as the original Spider-Woman. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.